This video is going to focus on using PyCharm to build a single-page web application. It's going to kind of look like Pinterest, and we're going to hook up to a database, then use Flask as a REST service to provide some data to AngularJS, and then style it just a little bit, all while using PyCharm. And I hope to be able to show quite a few PyCharm tricks that you can learn to help optimize your workflow. So we'll name the project pin clone, and then set the project type to Flask project. And then once I hit OK, you can see that it generates a basic Flask Hello World application. And I can actually just hit the debug button here, and this will start the server on port 5000. So over here, I'm trying to connect to port 5000. If I hit refresh, you can see I get Hello World because our route is returning Hello World. I can actually put a breakpoint here, and once I hit refresh again, if I had any variables to inspect or anything, I could start debugging right away. And that's how fast you can actually get up and running with Flask and PyCharm to start debugging and building your application. So let's go ahead and start building out our application. I'll just let this continue, turn off the breakpoint. And a couple things I'll want are SQL Alchemy and Flask Restless. You can see in the preferences, if I open them up, and I go under the project interpreter and look at my Python interpreters, that I already have Flask Restless and Flask SQL Alchemy installed. So I'll get things like autocomplete inside of my project. If you don't have them installed, you can actually just click install, and you can search for Flask, and you can find the different things you'd want to install, such as Flask Restless. Then you can just click install package, and it'll install those packages for you. You can also use the UI here to generate a virtual environment if you want to, so you can set up your project however you want to using this UI. Let's go ahead and start working with SQL Alchemy by typing SQL al and then just hitting Control space, and then PyCharm can find it for us. You'll see that it's still underlined in a red squiggly saying it can't find the reference, so if I hit Alt Enter and import this name, it'll find that and import it for us. So I don't have to worry about typing this out myself. Then I'll wrap the application and then just introduce a variable which I'll call db, and that'll set up SQL Alchemy for us. Now I just need to do a tiny bit of configuration as far as app config, then SQL Alchemy database URI, and then select all of it and uppercase it. Then I can assign this to SQLite and our pin DB, which will be created for us. Now I can set up our pin model by typing class DB model, which will have an ID, which is a column, and then we'll import that. And this will be an integer, and then we'll import that with a primary key of true. We'll have a title, which is another column, which is text this time. And this is not unique. And then basically we'll have an image, which is just text as well. One thing to notice here is that there is a gray underlined squiggly here that says there's expected 2 blank lines, found 1 in PEP 8. If you hit Alt Enter on this, it'll suggest to reformat the file to fix it. So if I just hit enter, it'll change the spacing around so that it matches PEP 8 properly. Now all I have to do is say db create all, and then that'll create the database for me the next time I run this. I'm also going to say app debug is true so that I don't have to worry about reloading the server every time. It'll just set up the reloader for me, and this will be the last time I'll have to reload it. So if I rerun, you can see that it's set up the pin.db for me because of how I configured this. And let's go ahead and tie into the pin.db using our database tools. So if I open the database tools and I create a new data source, I can select the SQLite drivers, so I can click here to download them automatically. I'll just hit OK. And then I can select the database URL, and what this is actually going to be is the path to my file. The fastest way to get the path to the file is to come into here, right-click, say copy path, And then I can go in and edit my data source again and change the path to the file to the actual path to the file. Once I hit OK now, we should be connected to the database, and you can actually see it's found the pin table, which is generated with the ID, title, and image. We can actually add data to this database manually a couple of different ways. The first way I want to show is just using the table editor. So from the table editor, I can hit the plus button, give it an ID of 1, a title of hello, and then an image of something.png. To check if that data exists, let's actually go into the Python console. Then I can say from pin clone import pin, and then say pin query all, and I'll just assign up pins to this. Then I can say pins, or actually just print pins, and you can see that we have an object here. So if I say print pins 0.title, you can see it prints out hello, which matches perfectly with the data that we entered. We can also use the Python console to create new pins. So if I import the pin from our pin clone and say pin is a pin with a title of second and an image of pin.png, I also need to import the database. And the database, I can say the session add our pin, and then session commit. And once I hit enter, I can actually check that it was added through the database tools here, hit refresh, and you can see that the database has been, the row has been added to the database. Now that we've played with the Python console and the database tools a little bit, let's actually use Flask RESTless to start pushing the data to the browser instead. So I'm going to set up an API manager, and I'll import the API manager, which wraps the app and sets the database to our database. Introduce a variable, and then I'll say our API manager create API using the pin model, and we'll want the methods to be basically everything. So get, post, delete, and put. So from here, if I change the URL to API and then pin, you can see that it'll return all of the pins that I've entered in there. So it's set up that API automatically just with these two lines of Python. So let's set up some HTML to render out our data that we have here. So I'll delete this route, and then we actually have some live templates. So if you type route and then hit tab, it'll generate a lot of this for you. I'll type index. I don't want the URL to be index, I just want it to be the main URL. And then I'll have this return app, and I'll send a static file called index.html. I'm actually also going to set our static URL path to be just the empty string so that the static URL path just matches here. I don't have to include the word static and everything when I'm setting up my HTML and JavaScript and CSS and everything. So I'll come to the static folder and create a new HTML file. I'll name it index.html, and we can just call this pin clone and say something like your app goes here. So that when I go back to port 5000 and refresh, you can see that it says your app goes here, and it has a title of pin clone. Like I said back in the beginning, we'll be using AngularJS to hook into our REST services we set up with Flask. So I'm going to install it using the built-in terminal and a tool called Bower. First I'll change into our static directory, and in our static directory I'll say Bower install Angular, and this will download and install Angular using Bower, which is basically just a client-side package manager for things like JavaScript libraries. You can check it out, just Google Bower online and it'll show you all the info you need. So if I look in here now, you can see that I have Bower components with Angular as one of the components, And I can actually reference this by simply typing script source, hitting tab to generate that using something called emmet, which generates those tags. Then I can type Angular and hit Control Space twice to find Angular in its relative directory. If I hit enter, it'll generate that entire directory path. So I don't have to type any of this. It'll just find it and generate all of that for me. Now that Angular is in our application, let's go ahead and set up our application JavaScript file. So it'll just be script source, and then I can just say js/app.js. And you can see that it's highlighting these, saying that it can't find the directory, it can't find the file. So if I just simply hit Alt-Enter, you'll be hitting Alt-Enter a lot when using PyCharm. You can create the directory and then create the file as well. So now that we have our app.js file, I can start writing some Angular code. So Angular module, we'll say an app with no dependencies. I'm not going to get too much into writing Angular, just there's a lot of syntax things you need to learn, and then it's boilerplate from there on out. So our app will have a controller called app controller, and then we'll say var app is this. That's kind of an alias for this, and then app message is am I working, just so we can see if this is working when we set it up the first time. Switch back over to the index file, and if this is working properly, when I set up our ng app to app and our ng controller to app controller as app, the app being the alias, when I say app message, this should, when I refresh, say am I working, because this is referencing this over here. One of the reasons we're using AngularJS is because it's really easy to set up these services. So I'll just inject the HTTP service, and I'll say HTTP get, and then I want the API pin, so we'll get all of the pins. Then on success, we'll get the data that we get back, or the response, and we'll assign the app pins to the data objects that we get back. So in our index, to show those, we'll basically just say div, then we'll ng repeat through the pins. So we'll say pin in app.pins, and then we'll display the pin title for each of those pins we created before. So if I refresh now, you can see it's showing hello and second, which matches up with the data in our database. Now, before we go any further, let's add a button which will add a new pin for us so that we can kind of populate our data easily. So I'll set up a button, which on click, I'll say app, add pin, and just we'll have the button say add pin. So we should see our button show up, and then we have an add pin button. I'll delete your app goes here because we don't need that anymore. And then in our JavaScript, I can say app add pin is a function which uses the HTTP service to post to the API pin, and it's going to post some data, and the data is going to be the title, and we'll just have the title be new, and then the image, and this image is going to be a fun little service called placekitten, so placekitten.com 200 by 200 image, and the image ID will be the current length of the amount of pins we have, so app.pins.length. And then once that's successful, let's go down to the next line. Once that's successful, we'll take the data and we'll push the response, once it's back, into our current array of pins, so that it automatically populates and refreshes the page for us. So if I refresh now and click add pin, you can see it's adding a new one, adding a new one, adding a new one, adding a new one. If I look in my pin table and refresh, you can see it's added all of those for me. Now that we have a bit more data, such as the images, we'll just go ahead and delete the original ones we created. I'll delete that row, delete that row. You can see if we refresh that those rows are gone. And let's go ahead and design our application just a tiny bit. So we can load the image, and I'm going to use something called ng source, which will hide the image until it's resolved what this comes in as. So pin.image. And then we'll also display the some UI here. So we'll call this UI with an input type, which is text. And this will display the pin title. And then we'll also have two buttons. One button will be a way to update. So we'll say ng-click app update pin, and then pass in the pin to update. And we'll say update as the text. And then this other one will be delete pin, and then pass in the pin to delete. So if I refresh now, you should see all of the images of cute little kittens and some UI that will hook up to update and delete them. On the JavaScript side of things, hooking up the delete and putting or updating is going to be very, very similar. So we'll say app delete pin is a function which takes a pin, and then we'll say HTTP delete, which will ping the API with the ID of that specific pin. So we'll say pin.id, and once that has successfully deleted, we'll take the response and then look up that pin that was deleted. So pin splice the app pins and the index of that specific pin, and then we'll just remove one of them from the array. Similarly, we'll say app update pin, which will take the pin, and then we'll say HTTP put that API pin, and then again the ID of that specific pin, and then nothing's really going to happen on success, so we don't even have to do anything. It's just going to put it and then update it. So if I refresh, hit refresh here, I can say delete. That'll automatically delete and refresh the page. I can say snow and click update. And that's refreshed. I can delete him, and then I'll call this guy hand, click update, and you can see that once I refresh here, it looks like I made an obvious little mistake here by not passing in the pin as the pin we want to update at that ID. So that's why these didn't update. So if I refresh and then again type snow and hand and make sure these are updated, then hit refresh again, it should maintain those changes. And if I check in our table again, hit refresh, you can see we have snow and hand as the two pins that have persisted. The last thing I want to do is give this app a tiny bit of styling to show off some of the CSS features. Before I do that, there's a plugin you can install in the preferences called Live Edit, and you'll find it in installed JetBrains plugins. It's called Live Edit right here. Just download it and install it. I already have it installed. And so with Live Edit, I can set up a new debug configuration in JavaScript. And I can just say, we'll just call this index.html. It doesn't matter what you name it. We'll say the URL is localhost 5000. And then we'll make sure that this URL maps to our static directory because that's where the files exist. So once I do this and I hit debug, you'll see a little JetBrains IDE support is debugging this tab open up in Chrome, so that anytime you make a change, so say for example I add there is an app below, it'll automatically update the browser without me having to refresh. And this works great when adding styles. So I'll go ahead and set up some styles. So we'll say link css styles.css. I'll generate the styles directory. I'll generate the style CSS. And then because I added a new CSS file in here, I do have to do a hard refresh to make sure it catches those changes for Live Edit to pick them up. But once I've done that, I should be able to say body, background color, and if I say red, it'll change the color to red. And I can actually, if I do control space here and start cycling through the colors, you can see all the different changes happening live while I update them. I'm actually going to grab an image from another project, kind of cheat here, and copy and paste an image into our static directory so that the background of the body is going to be a background image, which will have a URL, and it's called Kuji, and I can do that same double control space to find it. And you can see it added the little pattern background for me automatically through Live Edit. So let's finish off our app by adding a class of pin to all of our pins so that we can style a pin and give it a display of inline block, give it a background. I'll say it's I like to use the slate colors, so we'll say light slate gray. Looks fine for me. And we'll do a border, which is 2 pixels, solid dark slate gray. And then a margin of 0, 2 pixels, and 15 pixels. And there's actually a trick here. If you want to use Emmet, you can do shortcuts like M0 to 15, and that'll generate all of that for you once you hit tab. So the same thing with padding. If I do P15, 15, 15, and hit tab, that'll generate that for us. Then I'll just say our min width is 200 pixels. There's another trick I use if things get a little bit out of sync. I set up a keyboard shortcut to reload in the browser automatically. In case some of those changes weren't catching, you may have noticed in the bottom right that those changes weren't taking automatically. If you fire reload in browser, that'll do that for you. And you can add a keyboard shortcut there. If you go into your preferences, go into the key map and do a search for reload in browser. And if you have Live Edit installed, this will show up. Then you can just say add keyboard shortcut and add whatever keyboard shortcut you'd like to add for it. And now we'll just go ahead and style the pins image just a tiny bit. We'll say the width is 100p, that'll be 100%. The border bottom is going to be a 5 pixel solid slate gray. The padding bottom is just 15 pixels. You can see when I work, I kind of switch between doing the Emmet style and just regular autocomplete, whichever's the most convenient at the time. And I'll say the margin bottom is going to be 5 pixels. So we just added a nice little separator there. So now we have our full application where we can add new pins. You can see if I scroll down, I can find them. And I can delete pins. I can update pins to Snowy Cat. Hit update and the changes will persist. Then I can add more pins and the cycle goes on and on. So hopefully that's provided a good overview of all the different tools you can use, from using the database tools and setting up the database through a new data source, using things like the Python console, using the debugger to start up your server and see what's going on in your application, doing live edit sessions through a JavaScript debugger, managing rows through the table editor inside of your database tools, doing all the things like autocomplete, auto importing, auto everything inside of Python and HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and using all those together to make really great apps and to make them really quickly with a great workflow.